everybody. I'm Caryn Hartglass. You're listening to It's All About Food. Thank you for joining me. Today, I can't express my emotions enough because I'm very excited to be speaking with the author of a new book. Nathan Lents, PhD, is the author of The Sexual Evolution, How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. Nathan Lents is a professor of biology at John Jay College, CUNY, and the author of Not So Different, Finding Human Nature in Animals, and Human Errors, a Panorama of Our Glitches, From Pointless Bones to Broken Genes. He has appeared as a scientific expert in a range of national media, including The Today Show, NPR, Access Hollywood, 48 Hours, and Al Jazeera's America. And he lives in Queens, New York. Shout out to Queens, where I live.
The best borough.
The best borough. I remember a few years ago, what was that travel magazine? They said it was like the #1 place to visit. That was a few years ago. Anyway, it's a fun place to be. And I just discovered another great person who lives there. Nathan, so thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. And thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
This show is called It's All About Food. My listeners may not realize the connection with your book and food, but I promise I will connect the dots somewhere along the line in this program because there is a connection. And also, when your publicist reached out about this book, I didn't barely even read anything about it. I was just following my intuitions. There was like some energy that popped out in the email. And I said, oh my God, I have to read this book. I responded right away, which I rarely do. And I know why, because this was an important book for me. So thank you for writing it. We're in these dark times. You know, I haven't been around since the first humans appeared on this earth, so I don't have any relative feeling about darkness because I think things have been challenging for a long time. But we're feeling some extra challenge these days. I want to bring up the first thing we can talk about, which is sex and gender. And I thought you might give us a little definition. You're a teacher, a professor in college. I'm sure you've done this many times, but I'm just going to ask you, could you do it as if you were speaking to that convicted felon, sex offender, liar, con artist who's sitting in the White House right now and who came out with this crazy executive order 14168? Go.
Okay, well, it's important to distinguish sex and gender. They are different things. They're related and they interact. But sex is a property of bodies. Animal bodies have a sex to them, are sexed is one way to say it. It's far more complex than a binary, and I'm sure we're going to get into that. But sex is generally thought of as the physical property of a body, of an animal body, whereas gender is a psychosocial phenomenon. It's psychological, it's sociological, and it has to do with how you express your sexed body, how you lived your sexed body in terms of behavior, but most importantly, how you interact with others, either in one-to-one or with your larger community. So it's basically how you express your sexed body in a social context. And so gender is a social phenomenon primarily, whereas sex is a biological or physical phenomenon. That's the best way to break it down. But it only gets more complicated from there because there are many ways by which we can define male and female. And I know it seems like this should be simple, and how could we be questioning these categories that we've had for thousands of years? What's wrong with us, for rethinking this? But if you just keep your mind open for a minute, sex is something that affects all your body, not just what's between your legs, right? There are sexed features, or sometimes we call them dimorphic features. Dimorphic meaning those which show some sex differences. Think of the very simplest one, height, right? Men are on average 3 or 4 inches taller than women. It doesn't mean every man is taller than every woman, but there's a sex difference there, an average sex difference. Well, you can apply that same logic all throughout their body. There's many sex differences, from basal metabolic rate, red blood cell count, white blood cell count, muscle mass, bone density. There's just all kinds of differences. And some of these stem from, the actions of hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Some of them are genetic. Some of them are stochastic, meaning it's kind of random how cells interact with the environment. If you rewound the tape of your own development and then replayed it, it might not come out the exact same way. In fact, it surely wouldn't. So sex is something that all aspects of the body, most aspects of the body, have some kind of difference, or expresses the sexed nature of the cells and genes inside your body. So if you want to reduce it all the way down to just which gamete you make, and there's only two gametes, sperm and egg, then male and female, you would be ignoring everything else that's going on in the body, which is much more complex. And those other things really affect how you live, your health, your diseases, and your daily life, how you interact with other people, how you use your body in physical ways. So sperm and egg are something that really have very little to do with how we live our lives day to day. And they really only are important to us in very specific moments of our life history. Whereas things like basal metabolic rate, for example, the size of the corpus callosum in your brain or the preoptic area of your brain, your ratio of gray matter to white matter in your brain, all of these things matter to you much, much more, and they do show some sex differences. When we say that defining biological sex is more complex than just sperm and egg, what we mean is there's a lot more in your body that depends on sex and that expresses sex. And that to take all of that into account gives us a much more accurate picture of what male and female really mean and exist in the world. It doesn't do away with maleness or femaleness. I've been accused of that. People saying, oh, now you're trying to say there's no such thing as male and female. And I'm like, where did you get that? All I'm saying is it's more complex. In fact, actually, I'm not denying sex differences. I'm affirming them, and I'm finding them interesting and worth exploring, rather than just saying, well, the only thing that matters is if you have sperm or egg. That doesn't matter to you very often at all. So anyway, that's the more expansive view of sex that scientists are now working on. It's a new expression of sex, so it's not everyone's going to be on board with it right away, but we're exploring it. And I think that this executive order is an attempt to undo a lot of important sex-based research and sex-based science that's going on. For example, women get lupus 9 times more commonly than men do. And we don't know why. We have some hints, but we really don't know why. It has nothing to do with their egg cells, I'll tell you that. Men, for example, get Parkinson's disease 2.5 times the rate, or 3 times, depending on which data you look at. There's lots of these diseases that show these important sex differences. That's something that you want your doctor to think about. I think you want your doctor to consider all of these factors. And so if you reduce it down to sperm and egg, you're really ignoring a lot of very important sex biology all throughout your body. That's all we're saying.
It was a great explanation. I think if you had given that to the person sitting in the White House right now, you would have lost him after about 5 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
He's got an attention problem.
It requires nuance and attention to detail and thoughtful consideration. So we're going to lose a lot of people. I understand that.
Yeah, unfortunately. But what I want to say about your book, The Sexual Evolution, as a biologist, you've made it very readable, very enjoyable, amusing. I think people need to know that when they go to read something like this. It's just so readable and so pleasurable. I can't say enough good about it because I enjoyed every page. I need distraction right now. I need something to keep me away from my phone and reading the awful headlines. And so I found it enjoyable and inspiring.
Thank you.
I feel like some definitions are important, or some explanations, but can we talk about is in science versus ought in philosophy, law, theology? Because that's a big one.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of people are also misunderstanding my book when I talk about animal behavior. They think that I'm saying that, oh, we see this behavior in animals, therefore it's morally permissible in humans. That's not at all what I'm saying. I think there's lots of things that animals do that we do well to prohibit. Animals, will kill each other violently sometimes. Animals will steal from each other. And animals don't have a lot of understanding of consent when it comes to sexual activity. They don't recognize taboos around, age of maturity or anything like that. I am not suggesting that animals are our moral guides. But what I am suggesting is that when we observe a behavior in animals as well as humans that means there's a biological basis for that behavior and it's worth exploring and understanding. Let's take same-sex sexual behavior, for example. Sexual behavior between members of a species that are the same sex. Well, for a long time, that was one of the reasons that was declared to be immoral is because it was considered unnatural, meaning it doesn't happen in nature. We know now that it absolutely does happen in nature, and it happens pretty much in every social species that we've looked for it, we found it. So that doesn't say that it's right or wrong. It doesn't make any moral claim at all. It just says you can prohibit this if you want, but you can't say it's unnatural. You're going to have to base that on something else. And you're going to have to convince your fellow citizens that you're morally justified without calling it unnatural, because that's just not true. Well, that's what I mean, where what biology brings to these questions is not the moral answers, but rather it describes the world as it truly is. I believe that we make the best decisions when we have the best information, the most complete picture, the most accurate picture. So when it comes to gender diversity, when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to sexual minorities and sexual behaviors, we need to explore it from all angles. And biology, I think, has too often been left out of this conversation. And I wrote the book with the idea of bringing the biology of sex into the public conversation, because I think we'll make our best decisions when we understand it the best. The other value, I think, in studying sexual behavior in animals, for example, is that it helps demystify this behavior and helps us understand why are we drawn into sexual relationships? What do we get out of them? Is it good for us? How is it good for us? Is it good for our species, communities? What do these relationships do for us? What is their natural history and their natural context? So again, that can only be a good thing to understand it in its full kind of biological complexity, because that way we as individuals and as a society can approach these important conversations from the best basis, the most complete knowledge set, if you will.
You're right. Sexual activity is not solely about procreation.
That's right. And that's what biology teaches us, is that the old ideas about sex that was really only for the purpose of fertilization, that's again, it's just not true. What we see in social animals is they use sex for a variety of ends, and it brings individuals together in a variety of ways. And so when we learn from that, we can apply it to our own lives or not. That's the other thing, is that we don't have to do anything with this information necessarily. We just, it would be good to know. And so one thing I think is interesting, though, is that if you look at, I think I make these comparisons a lot in the book. If you look at solitary animals versus social animals, there are animals that in their adult life are mostly solitary. Those are the animals that tend to only have sex for reproductive, direct reproductive goal. But all the other animals, which is most mammals, are social. They have social relationships throughout their adult life history. Those are the ones where they do interesting things with their sexual behaviors, and that's worth studying. To me, that correlation really teaches us that sex is an important part of our social life, not just about making babies, but rather caring for those babies, for example, and other things. And the one that's the least controversial, of course, is that sex between a mated pair keeps them together, right? Because they have a neurohormone-based attachment that is reinforced by sex. Sexual activity releases hormones in our brain that affect how we think, how we feel about someone. And so it's part of the glue that holds couples together is sexual activity. It's not the whole glue, it's not the whole thing, but it's part of it. So, and that's the one that's the least controversial. But I use that as an example to say we've recognized that sex is not just for procreation, right? That it is also for married couples, we'll say, to strengthen their bond. Okay, well, if we accept that it can do more for us than just reproduction, what else can it do besides, strengthening a pair bond?
I think when society looks down upon sex outside of for procreation, we see a lot of negative repercussions as a result. you don't really go into this in the book, but I'm thinking of many things, priests, for example, that have to be celibate, and some of the things we've seen them do as a result, which isn't very nice in terms of pedophilia.
Well, yeah, and I think I would like to explore that a little bit, because what we've seen with, for the example of sexual abuse by clerics, it's at least partially driven by their social isolation. And sex is a social activity. Now, I'm not saying it's the only one. And I'm
Sure.
not saying that this means celibacy is untenable for us, but it does mean that if you're going to deny someone this and ask them to deny themselves this behavior, what are you replacing it with? How are you having their needs met, their psychological needs met, when, it's just like with your diet. If you're going to cut out vegetables, you're just not going to eat vegetables. Since this is a food podcast, that would be a bad idea, most of us. Right? But let's say you had some medical reason why you had to. Well, okay, what are you replacing? The vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, the other things that vegetable gives us? Maybe there are ways that we can, through supplementation and other food choices, you can get there. This is an analogy, and
Sure.
like all analogies, it's not perfect. But I think that when you talk about singleness or celibacy or whatever, there are asexuals. That's a true sexual orientation. How are their psychological needs being met? Their social psychological needs being met? And I think that we have underserved asexuals, for example, and priestly celibacy would fall into that. And I think that some of the psychological damage that was done to priests, for example, through celibacy, was not their fault. Now, what they did was their fault, of course. I'm not saying that we don't blame them, but we can do a lot better for people by understanding these behaviors. Again, if you want to use priests as your example, what we've seen is that the religious orders, which are priests that live in communities with each other, had much less of these problems than those who were out in the diocese living more or less alone, with themselves. So, so that tells us that the religious community was providing something that they wouldn't get from an intimate relationship. They're getting from this community. I think there's important lessons there.
There are so many great stories in this book of different species and how they live with each other and their sexual preferences and diversity. It's just fascinating and a great read. And of course, we can't go into all of them, but I just wanted to touch on one or two. You mentioned the movie Finding Nemo, which is one of my favorite films. And from a vegan point of view, because I am vegan, I love the scene with the sharks. And and they're saying,
fish are food, or fish are friends.
Fish are friends, not food. And I really look forward to a time when the lion lies down with the lamb and the sharks, don't eat any people. But aside from that, you talked about clownfish, and it's really fascinating how there's the alpha male, there's the alpha female. The alpha female, when she dies, the alpha male becomes the alpha female. I'm just rushing through this, but how do our bodies know that?
It's fascinating, right? It is fascinating.
Where do they get that message and then know to do that?
So we're working on it. And in fact, clownfish is one where there is some research on it. But what we know for sure, because they're not the only species that do social-based sex switching, is that we have a sense of our social environment. We keep track of the individuals that we have a social relationship with. And so do fish. Even clownfish with their tiny, tiny brains, they can tell. So when the alpha female is lost, the alpha male, the gene expression changes. So the way that they use their DNA starts to change, but the first changes are in the brain, not in the gonad. So the body doesn't begin to change first, the brain does. And what the brain is doing is switching on that program to say, oh, I'm the largest male, the oldest and largest male. There is no female. So that's a program. Those are like the parameters that switch on a program that says, my turn to become the female. And so the alpha male, in about a 30-day transition, becomes the alpha female. The testes wither away, the ovaries develop, and within 30 days, they start to produce egg cells. And that switching that takes place, as I said, begins in the brain as the fish senses this change in the social environment. There are other species where whether they become male or female depends on the social environment, right? And so there is an input of sociality that goes into sex determination. And that's just one example. What I think is even more interesting about the clownfish is that they all wait their turn based on age.
How civilized.
How civilized, exactly, because biologists have been trying to tell us for years that nature is just red in tooth and claw, right? They're just all fighting each other for jockeying for the best position, and they would, fight their way to the top if they could. But here you have clownfish, which dutifully wait their turn. They even halt their own growth based on where they are in the ranking system. The ranking system goes alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and so forth. And it's based strictly on age. And what's interesting is that also is a quality control mechanism. So some animals do use fighting and combat, hopefully not to the death, but some kind of struggle to determine rank. Right. And so we would call that a dominance hierarchy, where it's really kind of physical strength. But and there's other ways to do it too, by the way. But clownfish have chosen longevity as their ranking system. And why? Well, if you have lived longer, then that means you've survived in the world. You've solved your challenges. You've gotten enough food. You've avoided danger. You haven't died of cancer or other kinds. So it's a nice conflict-free form of quality control. And therefore, only the oldest are allowed to reproduce, means that their genes must be pretty good because they've survived long enough to do that. Now, we think of just being old doesn't say anything about your genetic quality. And that's because our species is designed where everybody pretty much lives to, reproductive age or beyond. We are a long-lived species. The majority of individuals that are born will live to a ripe old age. But that's not true in fish, right? They die a lot earlier in their life, and then they have what's called a steady rate of mortality all throughout. Their deaths are not all clustered at the end. They're most at the beginning and then steady all throughout their life. So if you have lived to be the oldest male in your group, you must be pretty well built. So it's a good system.
At the very least, that I want to take from it is respect for your elders.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's a lesson that comes up throughout the book multiple times. We can't cover everything or else no one's going to buy my book.
Exactly. I don't want to give away everything.
But respect for elders is something and in fact, in the next book that I'm working on now, I'm going to talk about that a lot more because genetic respect for elders is something that's in our species as well. And something we do well to promote.
Another species to touch on. I made a big list. Of course, we can't talk about all of them. Lions. Okay. I just was chuckling the whole time reading about lions because we have such a macho image about male lions and their superiority in the jungle. We've got the new Mufasa story coming out with Disney. There's something people need to know about male lions and what they do with their bros.
There's a lot that people should know about lions. Whoever is the publicist for lions has really outdone themselves because they even have the nickname King of the Jungle. And lions don't live in the jungle. Lions live in the grasslands. They live in savannas. So anyway, but there's this image of an alpha lion, a sole male alpha who then lives in a pride with 7 or 8 females. That's the way that some lion prides are, but actually a majority of lion prides are dominated. And when I say use dominated, I'm even going to walk that back too. But are led, we'll say, by a coalition of males that are ranked in terms of privileges. Some privileges, and those males are bonded to each other. They have sex with each other. They spend a lot of time in affectionate contact. And in fact, those coalition of males spend more time in contact with each other than they do with the females. The females tend to pack together and the males tend to pack together in these lion prides, in these multi-male lion prides. The males have more sex with other males than they do with the females, except when the females are fertile. And what I think is interesting is that fertility is still part of their sexual life. They're aware of when females are in heat, and then the females, of course, present themselves. That's when they approach the males for sexual activity. And that's one kind of sexual activity. And then they go back to their sex-segregated sexual activity, and they bond that way. And so here's a species that very freely moves between the different uses of sex as a friendship, as an alliance building, as a pacification, right? Because if the male lions all fought each other, you can lose. In fact, both partners can be mortally wounded, right, in a lion fight. Lions are very powerful animals. So they found a different way, a safer way to establish their hierarchy and their ranking system, and that is by having sex with each other. What's interesting, though, if we're going to keep going with lions a little bit, is that we have this idea that the males are in charge. And that's because of our of our lens of looking at it, of our male lens of a patriarchal way of looking at that, because the males are in charge of sex lives. They decide who has sex with whom. And of course, the alpha gives himself the highest privileges, and then he grants sexual access to females, for example, to other males based on rank and all that. But that's literally the only thing that the males are in charge of. The females run the show when it comes to feeding privileges, when it comes to raising the cubs, when it comes to hunting as a pack. The females do almost all of the hunting. The males do very, very little hunting. The males do very little childcare. So it's most of your daily life is not spent having sex, right? Even if you're a lion. So most of the daily life is actually run by the women, who also have a hierarchy. They have a ranking system. High-ranking females do tend to be older, but they also tend to be the females that have social relationships, right? That enforce that. And that just shows another way, even in the same species, to determine rank and hierarchy is not by fighting and physical aggression, but by congeniality and by, being a good citizen, so to speak, and being popular. And so the females really run the show when it comes to lion prides. Males get all the attention because researchers have long favored studying male behavior over female behavior. That's been a bias since the very foundations of modern science. And if you don't believe me, there's a book on that. I don't know if you allow profanity on this podcast.
Absolutely, go for it.
The title of the book is Bitch, the Female of the Species, and is written by Lucy Cook, came out last year, or maybe it was the year before now, and a fascinating book that talks about how understudied females are pretty much across the board. In humans and in most other animals, we only really are interested in male behavior, and we have been. And now that we're actually looking at female behavior in lots of species, we're finding an enormous amount of complexity and an enormous amount of new behaviors altogether are being discovered by just looking at the other half of the population.
I think that's interesting because I think you mentioned it, that the female is the default species.
Right. So in the developmental program of vertebrates, female is the
So shouldn't we be studied more?
Yeah, in a sense, that's right. Yeah, it's much more of a default paradigm. Yeah.
I found an underlying thread showing through nature that cooperation is more beneficial than battling out things within one's own tribe. I love that. We can't go into all of them, but I just wanted to point that out because we could learn from that one.
And what's interesting, again, because males have dominated, science for so long, we looked at the cognitive abilities that humans evolved over the other apes. Humans obviously have some cognitive abilities that really put us on another plane of existence, if you will, because we can have podcasts and write books and have conversations. But we have focused so much on the competitive value of those cognitive features rather than understanding their cooperative value, because the same skill set that is used to compete against someone is used to cooperate with them, because to cooperate with someone, you have to understand their point of view. You have to understand what motivates them, how they think, how they work, what might work if you want to work together. Those are exactly the same things you need to know if you want to win against them. And scientists have so much concentrated on the competitive side of that equation. And I think now that anthropology is starting to become much more inclusive of women. And in fact, women are taking leadership roles in the field of anthropology. We're starting to really understand that cooperation and social relationships probably were the driving factor in our cognitive abilities. Not so much competition. Competition was always there, but it's what we call intergroup competition and intra-group cooperation. So within the group, you cooperate, but you are competing against other groups. And that's where our xenophobia and racism comes from. But and so in other words, the competition is what bred our worst features, and the cooperation is what bred our most pro-social features.
And with cooperation, these social interactions, sex is included, not just for procreation. And that means sex between all genders, because there are quite a few in humans.
Right. Yeah, that's right. If you accept that sex can do more than just reproduce babies, then sex with any member of the group is potentially beneficial. And so really heterosexuality would be the one that's weird because you're now writing off half of the population if you won't have sex with members of your same sex, right? And in fact, there's so much sex segregation that goes on in mammals that the most of your social partners are in the same sex. And so if you have a sexual aversion to the people who are your closest social partners, that would come with costs. And that's kind of what we see in other animals. But humans have been trained that you're either this or that, right? I mean, bisexuals, people thought that bisexual what didn't even really exist.
Hmm.
And now this has come full circle. A study just came out last week that basically says everyone is a little bit bisexual, right? Or at least has the potential to be. And then you kind of send one direction or the other as you nurture your sexual your activity as through puberty and stuff. And then it kind of takes shape based on experience and environment and exposure and social influences, of course. But that we have a more default bisexual nature that much more so than we ever thought. So I think we're finally getting a clearer picture on that as well.
I just want to talk about two things from my perspective. So as a woman, and I identify as a woman, and I was born as a woman, and I also see myself as fiercely heterosexual. That's just my point of view. Is it nature, nurture? I recognize discrimination at an early age, being a girl and then a woman. As an engineer in Silicon Valley, there was just so much discrimination. I was raised Jewish. I'm not religious now, but there was so much prejudice in there against women. And all of this helped form my perspective. But still, in society, you can't help but have natural prejudices being raised in a certain environment. And I fight that and try and stay open. And I'm always learning new things. And I learned new things in your book. Thank you very much. When I was in high school, my two best friends, we had a moment where they told me two young women were having intimate relations. And I guess what shocked me at the time, I was never thinking about homosexuality at that point in time. I was very hormonal and always thinking about boys. But what shocked me, I guess, was having two friends that I was really close with. I didn't know what was going on. 50 years later, we're all still great friends. And I learned so much from that moment. And I'm always trying to think outside of the box, if you will.
That's a great story because a lot of them don't end as happily as that. A lot of times friendships get lost when one party or the other talks about, sexual feelings or sexual attractions. It can really disrupt a relationship. Or if you have a group of friends and then two members start to have sex, and then it can disrupt the whole social dynamic. So kudos to the three of you for navigating that, because our culture doesn't prepare us for that, right? It's like boys are over here, girls are over here. You come together, for date night or whatever, but they're really your friends are going to be here, and you don't have sex with your friends, and we want to have this nice, neat segregation that goes on, and you can understand some of the benefits of it. As a gay man in New York City, I can understand sometimes why you might want to have some separation between regular social partners and romantic partners. I totally get it. But with society evolving, if you will, on sort of this, we're in this territory and we get to explore all of this complexity for ourselves. So kudos to the three of you. That's a really great story, especially after all this time.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever shared that story, but there's always a moment for stories. I want to understand something. I'm a vegan. I don't like exploiting anything living, but I'm wondering how these studies are done and how we can see what the fish are doing, how we can see what the lions are doing. Is this some sort of voyeurism? They're looking at sexual acts.
With larger animals, it's almost all going to take place in the wild. So the early era of animal behavior studies was called behaviorism, and that was done in laboratories. Horrific conditions, and we can have a whole podcast about that. But more germane to this book, a lot of what we learned just really didn't hold up because animals in a laboratory do not behave as they do in the wild. And I'm not saying nothing was learned from those studies, but I mean, everything had to be rethought once we kind of realized, oh, wow, that's a terrible environment to keep a mouse or a rat or anything else. And they don't behave as they normally do. They're not healthy. They're not happy. They're not at all well-adjusted psychologically. I mean, actually, just one small example. almost everything we know about addiction, the chemical, neurological basis of addiction, was founded on this principle that rats or mice will get addicted to cocaine if you give it to them. And that's because we did those experiments in laboratories where their life was intolerable to live. So, of course, they're going to go for cocaine, right?
Right.
You would go for anything that helps you forget that level of constant misery. But when you put a rat or a mouse in a rich environment that has a lot of stimulation, that has social interactions, I mean, they were these mice were kept on their own as in individual cages. That's no way to live, right? They're very social species. But when you keep them in a more natural environment, they don't get addicted to cocaine, not
Wow.
at super high rates. Some of them will,
That's
most of them won't.
fascinating, right? What is it telling us?
It's yeah, exactly. So we have to really rethink what we do. And so now, and that matters. That really matters because we used to think that addiction was inevitable, that it was purely a brain chemistry. There wasn't anything you could do. It was a disease, and it could be a disease. But the thing is the answer to that is social relationships, social stimulation, right? So we have to work with people who have substance abuse disorder and remind them that the dopamine that they're seeking from these drugs can also be provided by other things in their life. And it's just a matter of finding that and repairing social relationships and so on. And the really good addiction programs sort of were doing that anyway, but they stumbled upon those truths after having been led in the wrong direction. So to answer your question, with larger animals, particularly mammals and birds, it's almost all done in the wild now. And so it is a lot of voyeurism, and you watch, and there are preserves where we do this a lot, so that way we know that animals are protected. Thinking mostly in Africa. With migratory birds, it's great because they come back to the same spot every year, and you can just kind of wait and collect your data in one season, and then when they go back south, then you come back and crunch your data and write your papers and all that. With smaller animals, a lot of is still done in laboratories. And for example, the clownfish, they're grown in aquaria and they simulate the natural environment. And then I imagine they would take some samples and things. So that would not qualify as ethical treatment of animals under a vegan philosophy. But with larger animals, it's largely done in a natural way. Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, Barute Galdikas, they're the ones who taught us that the only way to understand animals is to watch them.
3 women.
Yeah, the trimates, the trimates. They taught us that the only way to understand animals is to watch them patiently from a distance for years and years and years without intervening. And then when you do intervene, you try to do it in a sort of culturally appropriate way. And then if you're doing an experiment, for example, like they would do this, like sometimes just put in a basket of bananas and watch what happens, when they come upon a big, cache of food, like how do the animals behave? So that's I think fairly ethical experiment to do. Although if we learned that violence ensued, obviously we would want to stop doing that. But
I just want to talk about bonobos for a minute.
My favorite.
Yeah, me too. I had a friend who opened a restaurant named Bonobos in Manhattan, David Norman.
Wow.
It was a raw restaurant. It closed some time ago and he has since passed. Sadly, he was a great person. But I learned about bonobos thanks to that restaurant and all of his passion around them. Can we talk about how they're like us or maybe not?
Well, bonobos are the other chimpanzees, right? There are 2 species of chimpanzee. The one that everyone thinks of, that's the common chimpanzee, and it is more numerous. It lives in a wider region of Africa. But then there's the bonobos or pygmy chimpanzees, and we're equally related to them. So it's like if you had 2 cousins, in the same family, you're not really more related to one or the other. They're our siblings, and we are equally related to them.
And they can both be very different, those
but
cousins.
But they are very different socially. Yeah, their biology is almost the same. You can see very little difference. You can spot them out after a little bit of practice, but generally they're very similar in their morphology. But in their social behaviors are very, 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 very different. So the chimpanzees are very male-dominated, very aggressive, pretty violent towards each other. They can be kind of nasty and brutish and kind of a might makes right sort of social philosophy. Now you can, with a lot of human contact, chimpanzees can, be gregarious, but they can be kind of nasty too. Whereas bonobos are sort of the opposite. Their social structure is matriarchal, but I avoid the word female dominant because when females are in charge, they generally don't do a dominance hierarchy. There is a rank, and that rank has privileges and things associated with it, but it's not enforced by physical dominance or physical aggression. The hierarchy in bonobos is about social relationships. So it's generally the oldest female is the one in charge because she has been nurturing her social relationships for the longest. Now, there are sometimes it's not the oldest, maybe it's the next oldest or the one after that because they were better at managing their social relationships. So it really is a popularity contest or a democracy, if you want to consider it that, where you have very egalitarian and a very flat social structure. There's not a lot of conflict and violence. And when there is conflict, it's generally resolved through sexual activity. They are the most sexual species you could ever imagine. They're constantly having sex with each other. The most common sex acts in a bonobo troop are female-female. The females are very sexual with each other. All manner of arrangements too in their sexual intercourse. Any sort of positions or activities you can think of, they engage in, including face-to-face intercourse and tongue kissing that really looks like the way we kiss. I mean, they will kiss for an extended period just because they love it. They really do look like us in their approach to sex, which is not what you see in chimpanzees. A chimpanzee sexual intercourse, the average is 13 seconds, right? And how long it lasts. But in bonobos, they can kiss for 20 minutes.
Wow.
So they're very sexual, and that sexuality, it creates a social cohesion. It creates a pacification. They resolve conflicts that way. I told you the experiment of if you just leave a bucket of bananas, the regular common chimpanzees, they sometimes will erupt in a frenzy that with struggles and physical pushing and fighting, whereas bonobos will have sex. They will have like an orgy when they find a big store of food because they have this excitement that they need to deal with. And then rather than fighting it out, they all have sex and then they're pacified. They're more like, okay, now what do we do with this food? Let's go eat it. Now that we've gotten that out of our system.
So I just want to take a moment here and breathe on all of that because we need to know about chimpanzees and bonobos and how similar they are to us and how we have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
We can adapt our behavior and decide which way we want to go. Do we want to be combative? Do we want to be cooperative?
Yeah, and I think we have the potential for both.
Right. So that's why this book and talking about all of these species is so, so important. Now, the question is, how did we get here? And in your book, you talk about the diversity in sexuality. There are males, there are females, alpha, beta, there's female and male mimicry. Some species change gender. There are hermaphrodites. They don't need another gender. There's just so many different things going on. And things seem to take a turn with humans because humans also embraced, as much as we know, because you say there weren't even words for all these different types of genders, but humans too embraced a wide diversity of sexual relations. And then agriculture came along. And hello, everybody. This show is called It's All About Food. And this is where I bring in that connected dot to food. And we've talked about agriculture a lot on this program and how things kind of went downhill after agriculture started for lots of reasons. And one of the things is this hierarchy that started. And when you mention the hierarchy with bonobos, I'm thinking we need to qualify hierarchy because matriarchal hierarchy sounds pretty good.
It does.
Patriarchal hierarchy is a disaster, and that's where we are today.
I agree. You said it very, very well. When men are in charge, when males are in charge, it does tend to be a more nasty, competitive, aggressive kind of dominance-based hierarchy. But when females are in charge, and I can list many species in which this is true, you get a much more egalitarian social structure, a much more rich social environment that is not so much based on competition and physical aggression. Now, there's exceptions to that as well, but largely and I don't want you to think like bonobos are all just, hippies. They still have some conflict and competition. None of this frees you from the regular kind of
Nobody's
conflict.
perfect.
Right. And it doesn't free you from conflict. It's just how you approach that conflict and how you resolve it. That's different. But what we see with human societies before agriculture, our lifestyle was called foraging, or sometimes called hunter-gatherer. That's the older way to hunter-gatherer is kind of what we used to say. We now say foraging societies. What we see in foraging societies is a much more egalitarian social structure.
Oh.
They're very different all across the world. So if you look at the Amazon basin or the Himalayan mountains, the Ethiopian highlands, all throughout the world, these very different social structures have emerged, almost to the point where there isn't a pattern. But what we can say was fairly common was there was a very egalitarian, very cooperative social environment. Sex was largely unrestricted. There was, there was always status and privilege, but it was, like I said, it wasn't based on physical aggression. And then agriculture started and everything changed. And what's interesting about agriculture is that it started more or less the same time, 10 different places around the globe that we know of, more or less in unison. And the same sorts of things happened, whether you're in Mesoamerica, South America, the Middle East, Central Africa, Papua New Guinea, the plains of Asia. What happened was agriculture allowed the accumulation of wealth. Suddenly, you could own things. You could own resources. You could own land, right? And that was never a thing for our foraging ancestors. They didn't own much of anything, but now you could. So then you had wealth inequality. You had haves and you'd have have-nots. And physical prowess, the ability to physically defend your stuff, became important. And then even more than that, the stuff that you had, you could use to buy other people's loyalty and respect, and they could then be your henchmen. So it didn't even require you to be physically strong anymore. And then what that led to was people, and I'm talking about men, but it would have been true for everybody, suddenly cared about their inheritance. So I have all this stuff and I have this land. Who gets it when I'm gone? Well, now we started to care about who was our own children rather than just the village children. So this concept of what we now call legitimacy, marriage and legitimate offspring. So these are my chosen heirs. This is my child and he gets the farm when I die, etc. So I think it's all traceable back to the accumulation of resources that came from agriculture. Before that, life really was better. Now, I'm not saying we should all just go back and live into the forest because most of us wouldn't know how to survive.
Yeah.
But what can we take from those lessons and apply them to our society now? And the lesson that, to me, more than anything else, is that wealth inequality is a guarantee of violence, conflict, aggression, and war, famine, and everything with it. Wealth inequality is the biggest enemy to a peaceful society. That's the lesson I take.
And we're seeing it right now.
Exactly.
And hopefully
you put billionaires in charge, then that's what's going to happen is the hierarchy
recipe
will get even sharper. It will get even sharper than it already is.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I like to say it's all about food, because Nathan Lentz just demonstrated to us how sexual diversity and so many other things are connected to food, starting with agriculture.
Correct.
That was the bad turn in human history.
The worst mistake we ever made. That's what Jared Diamond calls it.
All right, the worst mistake we ever made. I'm going to use that one. So we have a few more minutes, and I always like to think about hopeful things. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the mountain gorillas of Virunga.
Mm-hmm.
Can we dwell on that for a moment? Because that society gave me hope.
Yes, me too. Me too. So the mountain gorillas of Virunga, let me just first say that in the early days of studying gorillas, we really thought we had it all figured out, that a gorilla group consisted of a single dominant male, the silverback, and a harem of females. And that could 7, even 8 females. And that was a group. We thought that's how they lived. Well, and the first, gorilla societies that we studied, that's how they lived. Well, what we've seen now is that's just one way. The mountain gorillas of Virunga have decided to live a different way, where they have multi-male, multi-female societies. These troops have now grown to 60, 70 members in some cases, and the males get along. They are not in conflict constantly. They tolerate each other's sexual activity. They're not close social partners, so you can tell there's some male-male antisocial nature to them. So they won't form friendships with other males. So there's clearly something, but that doesn't stop them from living in a group with them. And a lot of people have focused on the males of why are the males doing this? Why are the males living so differently? I think we need to take a close look at the females, because the females organize the social structure in most of the other apes. So I'm wondering if the females decided that they were tired of all the male-male violence, and instead of sending their sons off when they got little big and starting to threaten their dad, they would send them out to that solitary phase where they grow a little bit bigger and then they come back and challenge or whatever. I think maybe the female said, "Why don't you stick around? We're gonna get daddy used to you as a grown adult, and you guys don't have to spend a lot of time together. But if you can just tolerate each other, we'd all have a happier life." I mean, I'm using words and language that, you know, this would be all just instinctual or emotive on their part, but that seems to be what has happened. The males just grew up and didn't leave. They stuck around. They tolerated each other, and they're thriving.
And it happened
They're
pretty
doing great.
quickly, this change in behavior,
In one
which is also
generation,
very
basically.
inspiring.
Yeah. And so my point in telling that story is if they can do it, we can do it. We can organize our society however we want. You know, there's a range, of course, of what's natural and what would not feel natural, but we have that range that we can work with, and we don't have to live the way that we are. And we have lived differently in the past. Even with our technology now and homes and all of these kinds of things, none of that depends strictly on having this severe hierarchy. So we would do well to dismantle it.
You talk about violence throughout the book, and you cited Pinter's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And that's good to know that with humans, violence has declined, even though, you know, we're seeing so many wars and horrible things happening. And things are happening not just in warlike scenarios, but in local communities with gun violence and just terrible things. But I have to mention that with animal agriculture, we have created a systematic method of violence against non-human animals, and that has increased. So
Massively.
I just think it's important to note, you know, maybe we're caring a little more about each other, but we have to recognize that we share this planet with so many species that are so important, and we can learn from them. And when we're talking about is and ought, I hope we learn that we ought not be killing other animals for food and other things.
Yeah, at the very least, we can do away with factory farming.
The very least, absolutely.
At the very least.
Just have to say that this program is called It's All About Food, and that's the way I feel. Okay, a few more minutes. Can we touch on transgender humans, because it's so important in 2025, and they're getting so much negative press, and it's so unfair. It's something that apparently has been going on forever. It's not something new, even though we're hearing more about it now. And there's no reason to be exploiting against them.
Right. It's true. A transgender identity and the idea of playing around with gender expression, masculine and feminine, that has been with our species for a very long time. And again, before agriculture, we have a lot of evidence that gender diversity was accepted. There were social roles for gender nonconforming individuals. And there's always been people throughout history, and those stories are being told now more, of transgender individuals who in some cases tried to pass for the other gender the best they could, and in other cases just took a different approach, an independent approach. And that's what we're seeing a little bit more now, is not so much that transgender individuals are trying to perfectly pass as the opposite sex, but rather they're exploring their own path of gender expression and identity. And the reason why I find that altogether natural is that's what other animals do too. You have minority gender expressions in other animals across the board, from fish to birds to mammals. I talk about examples in other species where a certain segment of the males will say do it differently than the rest, and they will express some typically feminine traits. It can be behavior, it can be morphology, that's outward appearance. Whether it's just a couple of feathers or a different color, this, that, or the other, or a shorter lifespan. There are animals that don't fit perfectly in their sex bucket in one way or another, behavior, morphology, whatever. And they find success in doing so because sometimes just being different than everyone else is an advantage, right? So that's it. But then also what we're finding as we study gender diversity is that they often play important roles in the social group. So a cooperator male cricket, or for example, or a cooperator male sunfish, partners with another male, and together they make a better partner for a female in that context. And so, you see these, and I give you several examples in that chapter of gender diversity in animals, of kind of finding another way it's not perfectly the opposite sex, but it adopts some behaviors or morphologies of the opposite sex in order to form a different gender, a gender that doesn't perfectly conform with their biological sex. And to me, that's the better parallel of transgender individuals, is people who take a creative approach to masculinity and femininity and mixing and matching different traits to form a new combination. Because sexual reproduction is all about creating new combinations of traits in order to create a diverse species that's ready for whatever the environment throws at them next. And gender diversity is part of our natural diversity. And I think we need to stop being so afraid of it.
Yes.
It's also such a small segment of the human population that has
Please.
such a huge segment so upset.
Right, exactly. It's crazy.
They don't really bother you, do they?
I know. What's the problem? I'm thinking about digital versus analog, binary versus waves. And we see the advantage of analog over digital in many different ways in terms of resolution and clarity and being able to see a wide range of things, whereas digital is efficient. I hate that word efficient. And it cuts out a lot of important sound information. And that's what we're losing. We want things to be neat and easy and efficient, but we lose so much. As quantum physics gets to be understood more, we're trying to understand, is it a wave? Is it a particle? Even at that tiny level, we don't understand the difference, and it's important.
You said it very well. The categories and labels are getting in the way of our understanding because when you only have two buckets and you want to put every individual into one of those buckets, you have no choice but to call someone a female mimic if he doesn't behave in exactly the way that you expect a male to behave. We are not digital. We are not binary. Biology never traffics in binaries. It's always about spectra and shades of gray. And so I'm glad to see that biology is starting to really assert itself in that way, to remind people that, listen, these categories and labels, we created them so that we can talk about these things, but they're artificial. And when the category and label isn't capturing it, it's time to rethink it. We don't serve the categories. The categories are there to serve us. So we need to revise them sometimes and add that nuance, because that's how life really works. Life is about diversity, nuance, shades of gray, new combinations. We really don't expect things to conform to nice categories with hard definitions. It's just not how life works.
Nathan H. Lents, author of The Sexual Evolution, How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute delight. I loved reading your book. It was a gift for me to get me out of my head and think in other ways. Thank you so much for joining me.
And thanks for having me. You're a great interviewer. This is a good conversation. Really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. Everybody have a delicious week.